Hey, International Friends Conference. My name is Jeff Reed. I'm Director of Digital Church Planting with Stadia Church Planting. I love the fact that I get to speak to y'all on this idea of planting digital churches. Love what's happening here with this conference, with this network. Jim has been telling me some of kind of the behind the scenes, some of the things that are happening. And anytime, honestly, anytime that I hear the word multiplication in church in the same sentence, coupled with the word international thrown in from the outside, listen, it's going to be a good day. So it is a pleasure for me to get to be part of this conference with you here. And let me just take a moment here. Let's tell me a little bit about myself, and then hey, let's just get into it, right? Because we really just want to like learn about what this whole idea of a digital only model of a church is. So for me, Jeff Reed, 15, 20 years church staffing experience, mega church, giga church, multi-site church. I've planted a dozen multi-site campuses in my church staffing career. 2018 kind of felt pump the brakes a little bit. It's time to get off of the church staff experience. And God, for whatever reason, led me to start my own business. It was called at the time, or it still is, theChurch.digital. Essentially, we focused on helping churches figure out how to do this whole online ministry thing better. Now, what you need to know about me is my first online Bible study I taught in the year 2000. That's right. Before video, we were doing text based 75 people around the world, and we're going through the book of James. That was in the year 2000. And so for the 20 years since then, whether it's been on church staffs or on the outside, I've really have been trying to help churches understand the necessity and the potential of what we can do in digital space if we really looked at doing church digitally. Now, up until March 13th, 2020, I don't think a lot of churches really cared about the idea of digital. Maybe they said they did. It was lip service, but when push came to shove, when budget came to focus, when it came time to put the best people in spots, digital was always second class, third class. Oh, it's the scraps. I actually had a pastor tell me once, and he meant it as a compliment. In fairness, he said, "Jeff, digital is like icing on the cake. You don't really need to do anything to make it work. But hey, getting some of those extra views really helps the numbers." Yeah. So digital is a completely different approach to that. And honestly, it's one of the things that I loved about Stadia. Stadia had this passion to do digital church before COVID. As a matter of fact, my first connection with Stadia was in 2019, September 2019. I literally get a phone call from Greg Nettle, president of Stadia. I have no idea who Greg Nettle is. I barely knew who Stadia was. As a result of that, Greg's like, "Hey Jeff, I hear you're into this like digital church thing. We're doing this blue sky session, kind of dreaming of what we could do in digital church. Why don't you fly out to Colorado with us, meet together with some industry executives, some mega church leaders." That was a weird word. As well as CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, online ministers. It was just I was the stupidest person in the room. You ever be in those meetings when you're the stupidest person in the room? Yeah, just a whole bunch of smarter people than me. And at the end of this, there was just so much excitement towards this idea of digital church planting as we dreamed, as we bounced off ideas and started brainstorming towards what a digital ecclesiology, what a digital church could look like while still aligning to the biblical functions. And so at the end of that 72 hours, that 3-day session in Colorado, I looked at Greg Nettle, president of Stadia, and said, "Hey, I want you to hire me as your director of digital church planting so I can execute everything that we just talked about." Greg looked at me back and said, "All right, we want to hire you to be the director of digital church planting for Stadia so that you can execute all this stuff that we just talked about." And that's where we are. So Stadia is in course right now. We actually are doing digital only church planting cohorts right now, where we've got church planters that we are working towards launching in call it early 2021. Although in digital, you always launch, you experiment, you go much quicker than you do in physical space. And then we're also doing discovery on a number of planters. So like we are doing this, we're rolling out and executing on this idea of digital only church planting. So looking forward to having much more conversations about this. Hey, up front, let's get into it. I'm going to let the cat out of the bag. I'm going to give you everything you need right now for digital church planting. You see, normally I would have like a slide deck, would have URLs and a bunch of things, and it would just provide you this resource. And through, I'm doing things a little different. I'm going to give you everything up front because when I go to conferences, when I hear people like this speak, half the time I'm paying attention to the guy, half the time I'm clicking or I'm doing my own research on what he said or reading the blog based on the thing that he said. And so like I'm reading at my own pace. So I'm going to assume some of you out there are that way right now. So here is your mega resource right here, thechurch.digital/planting. Thechurch.digital/planting. Every blog, every podcast, every interview, every ebook, every video, every stream that I've ever done talking about this idea of digital church planting is right here. So do me a favor, open up another tab. Don't close YouTube. You want to listen to me at least give me the respect of listening to me talk through this. Listen to me talk, open up a separate tab, click through it through there, stay tapped in. Man, look, I'm even in, this is pre-recorded. I'm even in the YouTube chat right now. So go ahead and say hi. I'm actually driving up the road right now. My son is in a state competition for spelling bees. Hey, my kid can spell. Who knew? So I'm pulled over on the side of the road. I'm not driving. I'm not going to die, but I will answer questions in YouTube on my iPhone, wherever I am along the Florida Turnpike, so that I can help guys like you, churches like you, understand this whole planting digital thing. So let's do this. Let's get started. So much of this, let's just get into it. There are so many questions when it comes to this idea of planting a digital church. Should we do this? Should we not do this? Is this okay? Is this too much? Um, is it a biblical? Does the biblical functions that we talk about in doing church, does that meet in digital space? Is digital community in itself, is a digital community worthy of having a church, or is that something that's reserved only for the physical space? Is digital discipleship effective? Is that a real thing? Like, can I really disciple someone in digital, or do I have to like breathe the same air molecules to get it to count? I'm a little sarcastic at times, so forgive that if it comes through. Are digital relationships even real? Are we talking real things here, or is this all just make believe? Now, believe it or not, like these are questions that I get on a regular basis talking about this idea of digital church. As a matter of fact, anytime I usually talk about digital church, if it's a truly like equal crowd, 50% of the church leaders that I will talk with will be praising and supportive of the idea of doing church in digital space. 50% of the people, well, they'll quickly banish me to hell at the idea. Well, maybe not to that extreme, but it's more of, you are definitely taking people out of the bride of Christ, so therefore you're sinning. I've had those conversations a couple times. So there are a lot of people who are supportive of the idea of a digital church. There's a lot of people who are fearful of it. And so, hey, you know what? If anything else, I love the fact that people are passionate about their God, hopefully, about their Christ, about their church, and to see how it'll play out. One thing out of respect that I want to say up front with Stadia, we always ask the question: just because we can, does it mean that we should? And so, even in context of how we went into the experiment, it was, let's acknowledge where we are, but let's also look at this idea of, just because we can do this idea of church digitally, should we really do church digitally? And so, for us, we actually started looking at other churches, other church planters that are already existing, that are doing this idea of church. Now, believe it or not, there are digital examples of churches right now out there. Churches with no physical footprint, churches that are meeting across multiple countries, multiple time zones, multiple continents, in doing and preaching the gospel and leading people and making disciples and Great Commission and all of that happening regularly. As men, we'll get into some of those here in a little bit, but for some of the reasons why we do digital church, well, we look at them and their stories. For example, digital churches, we're learning, number one, they reach a different type of person. Digital churches reach a different type of person. One digital church tells me, hey, Jeff, 85% of our of attendance of our online services, 80 to 85%, comes from lost people, unsaved. As a matter of fact, they're unchurched. They have no history of church. One particular VR church, DJ Soto, 85% lostness, atheist, attend these church services. Evidently, it's easier for atheists to engage in spiritual things by putting on a goggle, VR goggles, and engaging in a service that way. Some of the people who serve at the church are actually not saved. They're not saved yet, but through relationships, through virtual reality, they're part of this movement of church. If even through those relationships, starting to gather a better understanding of who Christ is. Another church would tell me 70% are unsaved or are not attending a physical church because they're de-churched. 70% at another VR church is de-churched. These are people that were so burned from previous experiences with church that their first step back towards the bride of Christ is through virtual reality. So you're saying you can get a different type of person to engage in a digital church. Number two here on the list, because people connect to community before they connect to Christ. Well, at least they do digitally. I would suspect maybe COVID has accelerated some of that. So I'm not sure I'm ready to say that is going to be so in the physical space, but I can definitely say that when it comes to what we're doing digitally. People will connect to community before they connect to Christ. And this is very opposite from what happens in the physical building. Physical building, we're very quick to, hey, raise those hands, come forward, do that. And we'll talk more about that here in a little bit. But digitally, they connect to community before they connect to Christ. Number three here, because we need to get out of the church service business. Event-based evangelism was waning even pre-COVID. Now mid-COVID, post-COVID, wherever you feel we are, honestly, I get the feeling that the coffin nail may already be like hammered. I think it's in. The idea of the event-based evangelism is waning quickly compared to this idea of this relational based evangelism. Number four, because we're ready to start movements. Alan Hirsch, is famous for the quotes, I'd rather have 12 disciples rather than 1,200 religious consumers. It's not the only Alan Hirsch quote I'm going to throw today. Just wanted to give you a warning towards that. Also, coupled with that, somebody asked Seth Godin. Seth Godin's one of the top marketing people in America. Disclaimer, he's Jewish. He's not Christian. Somebody asked Seth Godin, how do I get my message heard around the world? I have an idea. I want it to spread around the world. How do I do that? Seth Godin's answer, a billion people do not care about anything that you have to say. You'll never get a billion people to agree on any one thing. And if you look at the political nature that's been, recent around, it's pretty true. Like, it's very hard to get a whole bunch of people to agree on one thing. He said, a billion people don't care. 100 million, 10 million, 1 million, 100,000, 10,000. Here's what you need to do. You need to tell the smallest number possible your idea, and you need to get them to own it, and then get them to replicate it, to multiply it. The irony here is one of the top marketing people in the world, who's not Christian, who's actually Jewish, described the idea of disciple making from 2,000 years ago. And so how we as a church, how we replicate this, why we should do digital, because we have this opportunity to replicate things, to scale things in an efficient, quick, clean way, as long as we can do this relationally, which we'll get to here in a little bit. Because number five, if you're keeping track at home, because culture has redefined community. Used to be, if you knew where the stoplights were, if you knew where the closest Burger King was, if you knew where the cops with the speed guns were, you're part of that community. Well, communities changed. There are 22 million people a week that are actively playing a game called Final Fantasy 14. May not be a big deal. 22 million. I mean, I live in Miami. That's literally like 4 or 5 Miamis regularly play this video game. What you need to understand is this video game is like a decade old. They're still playing a video game from 10 years ago. Why? Because that's where their friends are. That's where their community is. That's where their guilds are. That's where they connect up with people and meet up and hang out and do weird things like farming. And I listen, I'm not understanding that culture. I'm not a native in the Final Fantasy 14 culture. But what I'm acknowledging is 22 million people still engage in a 10-year-old video game because that's where they hang out. And why are we, the church, not even thinking about going into spaces like that? Now, that may be crazy, but we'll get into that in a little bit. But the number 6 reason, and arguably I would say this is probably the top, or at least the most relevant for today. COVID didn't change culture. COVID accelerated it. We were already trending down a road. We 5G was already going to be a thing. By the way, 90% of the world, 2030, pre-COVID, 90% of the world was going to be on 5G technology. I would suspect that even got accelerated as timelines got quicker. The next 2 billion people on the planet are going to have high-speed internet access going off devices like these. And so we're going to have an opportunity to connect with people in a new way. Digital gives us a whole new opportunity, potential to reach the person either next door or on the other side of the planet, which is entirely ironic that I'm having a conversation here with international friends talking about multiplication. Because if anybody is going to understand the impact of a digital church to reach somebody on the other side of the planet, it's going to be you. Cool. Let's keep going. Language is important. We're talking a lot about this bleeding edge stuff, right? And I'm using this word digital church. Let me describe specifically what I mean. There's this idea of phygital. Now, Stadia does this as well. Stadia, churchplanting.org/phygital, Phygital. And it's the combination of physical and digital. So if you are an established physical church and you're trying to figure out how to broadcast your services online, or you want to better strengthen your small group, or you want to develop a multiplication disciple making strategy and you want to incorporate digital to do that, which is a great idea, by the way, that is all centered around this idea of phygital, Phygital. This is a great idea. Every church on the planet should be phygital. Stadia is working with every one of their church plants to make sure that they are phygital. And they've also have done training with 150 plus churches in 2020 towards being a phygital church. So there's intentionality and structure through Stadia of helping churches that are already established move their ministry away from just a physical space, utilizing the strength of digital to become phygital and then move forward towards creating a disciple maker. That's awesome. But that is nothing of what I'm going to talk about in this conference, because for us, I'm looking at this as an approach of planting a digital only expression of church. This is not like a multi site where we're just doing our physical ministry digitally like we would do a physical ministry in one physical neighborhood into another physical neighborhood. It's not like that. What I'm expressing is the idea of recognizing that digital community is a community worthy of a church, and we are planting churches in those digital spaces just like we would a physical church. The relationship, the intertwining, for it to be successful, if we are talking digital only expressions, if you're really wanting to get edgy with this stuff, I'm encouraging it to be separate from the physical or loosely intertwined at a decentralized level as opposed to a centralized level. I can unpack all of that at a later point. But the point is that this is more of a church planting strategy. We are planting digital expressions of church. We are not teaching you how to broadcast your services online to get to a better reach of your physical services in digital space. Once again, we'll get to all this here in a little bit. But here's where we know trends are moving more and more digitally. The heart of what I'm talking about here is not this idea of technology. It's people, it's relationships. It's not that event-based evangelism. It's not creating a virtual room. Instead, it's caring much more about the individuals. We're seeing huge success of this right now as we're looking at digital church planters that are planting digital only expressions of church that is separated from the physical building, where there is no physical building, there is no physical strategy. It's all done. Disciple making is all done digitally. And a lot of these are available. Once again, if you go to theChurch.digital/planting, you're going to see a large number of stories, interviews, podcasts, idea generation, iterations of what these people are doing. So hit that /planting page, theChurch.digital/planting, and then you get more information there from that. But DJ Soto, VR Church, essentially he's on 3 continents at this point, I believe. America, Europe, Asia Pacific. He's on multiple platforms, Alt VR, Rec Room, VR Chat. He runs a Discord as well that unifies everybody together. So DJ Soto at this point probably has 5 or 6 church plants that are operating underneath him. Now, he doesn't preach at all of them. He's freed up and has let others preach towards it. But DJ VR Church, this is like the goggle thing where walking around with avatars. As a matter of fact, he was basically made fun of. The Daily Show, BBC, Comedy Central, I'm trying to think, Fox News, several people ran stories on him. The Daily Show mocked him because he was baptizing people in virtual reality. Now, some of you maybe even just freaking out at the idea. Wait, you're baptizing people in virtual reality? Does that count? Well, what is baptism? It's a symbol. It's a gesture. It's done in the presence of believers, and it's done in the eyes of God. Um, Maybe. I tend to think so. And the people that I have seen get baptized in virtual reality, their lives were changed as a result of it. We'll get more into the online to offline here in a little bit because some of you guys are asking those questions. DJ Soto, great thing doing there with virtual reality. Angela Craig, Pursuit Church Live. She's Assemblies of God Church, the first Assemblies of God Church in Facebook, as a matter of fact. She's in 40 languages, 43 countries. Last I heard, something like that. Phenomenal disciple making movement utilizing Facebook as the method to connect, engage with, build relationships, and then disciple. Even to the point now that through this distribution network that she has on Facebook, she's growing that into micro locations where, once again, online to offline, what we're seeing happening in online space is starting to affect offline relationships. You'll learn more about offline in a second. Jade Earhart, Love Clan. I love Jade. Jade's a video gamer who's on Twitch. Like, I don't know what the guy, he sleeps and he's on Twitch. This is literally what he does. He's on Twitch, meeting people, engaging with people, building relationships with people, building influence with people. And through that influence, he routes people into disciple making training. He's actually doing like the 3/3, the 4 fields kind of approach. He does that in digital space and is replicating and is training the trainers to go out and to unleash, not only in digital space, but in physical space. And another one here, the fourth one here on the list would be Tyler Sansom. Tyler Sansom used to be an online pastor for it's one of my favorite churches in the country. It's a small church called First Capital Christian. It's sort of 700 people, so small to medium size. First Capital Christian Church, Corden, Indiana. 700 people would meet at their physical building, and he was the digital pastor. He's got, I don't know, 23, 25 micro locations that have popped up. It's just has He's been very good at creating disciple makers and giving them purpose and then unleashing them out, so that he's got volunteer campus pastors leading micro locations in hospital rehab centers, orphanages, prisons, after school daycare centers, all sorts of missionally located, purpose based spots there within the cities and surrounding areas. And there's been so much success with this church. They actually spun it off where it's no longer attached to the First Capital Christian. It's now Church Anywhere, which is a completely separate entity. It's under the same hierarchy, but it's more like we have a physical church, we have a digital church, as opposed to a one church that's unified with two campuses. So you can see how we have people that are having success. And what's interesting with the majority of these that I described, you're hearing this idea of digital ministry that's affecting the physical world. They're not just staying digitally. They're not just being digital Christians. What you're hearing is that it's starting to affect the physical realm. Put a pin in that. We're going to come back to that here in a little bit. Hey, let's talk about Billy Graham. Billy Graham, 1995. Billy Graham preached one sermon to literally 1 billion people. 1 billion people heard Billy Graham's message. Video from it in 1995 was bounced off of 34 or 40 satellites, something like that, something crazy. Real-time translators translated it. And so it could literally, his one sermon was heard around the world. It was on global missions, ironically, was heard around the world. That was 1995. Billy Graham had figured out this idea of reach. He figured out in 1995 how to use the technology to have one-way communication. Now, Billy's not talking literally to 1 billion people, but Billy is connecting with 1 billion people, as in 1 billion people are watching Billy and hearing Billy in a language that they can understand. This is reach. It's one-way communication. There's a higher challenge for us, though, and it comes down to this place of two-way communication. I would call that engagement, engaging with people. Now, in 1995, if I wanted to engage with someone, I mean, let me tell you my story. 1995, I was a college freshman at Texas Christian University, Fort Worth, Texas. Go Horned Frogs. That's who I was. And so for me, I wanted to, as a college freshman in 1995, I wanted to have two-way conversations with my girlfriend, who's actually now my wife. She was a high school senior in Miami, Florida. And so, being long distance relationships, we wanted to talk two ways. And in 1995, there wasn't much technology for the engagement. Definitely nothing that was like FaceTime or Zoom, where it's webcam based. At maybe you're doing some sort of AOL instant messenger. I don't want to just give somebody a like a heart attack by saying AOL, but AOL IM was a thing. Or you're picking up this device, this actual phone. Do you believe people actually talk into this? And you having a conversation where I was paying Southwestern Bell 45, 50 cents a minute to talk with my girlfriend long distance, who's just, maybe 6, 8 states away. See, that's what engagement and reach looked like in 1995. Today in 2020, 25 years later, I mean, great. Hey, I can pick up this device, I can do a Facebook stream, and I can connect with anybody. Like similar to what Seth Godin says, I don't know that everybody's going to understand you. I don't think that everybody's going to care, but it's easy to set up that broadcast that can go everywhere. Right. So the power of the internet isn't the reach, it's really the engagement. You see, that's where the strength comes in. It's not telling as many people as possible as much as it is engaging and having relational two-way conversations with people, and through those relationships point them to Christ. And really what it comes down to is that's the standard. That's the standard that we should be holding our digital churches to. And that standard, I'm going to borrow this from Saddleback Church. They use it for their church online. They've done it for over a decade. It's online to offline. Simply put, the gospel that we learn in our online world, it has to influence our offline relationships. Otherwise, we're creating consumers. So let me boil it down, simply. The fruits of the spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. I think I said them all there. You can put it in the chat if I missed any of them. But that has to be exuded physically. Like if I'll just use me as an example, right? So if I attend a digital church, or maybe I even am a pastor of a digital church, but let's just assume I'm an attender. I'm exuding the love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. I'm doing all that in digital space, right? Because that's what good Christians do. They exude it in church. But in my home, verbally abusive to my kids, physically abusive to my wife. I steal regularly from my workplace. What am I? So I'm showing my Christian. I'm exuding my fruits of the spirit digitally, but not physically. At best, I'm a consumer. At worst, you can probably use far more graphic words to describe what I am. Hypocrite would actually probably be more accurate. And so the challenge for us is to create a disciple with digital tools that is replicating that self, not only digitally, but into the physical realm. You want somebody that's showing the fruits of the spirit digitally and physically. Somebody who understands maybe even the gospel of impacting people within their physical circle of influence digitally, as well as their physical circle of influence. Do it digitally and physically. That's a hard challenge. That's a hard standard to put in place. But once again, I think that's biblical. James 1:22. Don't just be hearers of the word, and I'm going to paraphrase online here. Don't just be hearers of the word online and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says, once again paraphrasing, in the real world. Don't just be hearers of the word online and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says in the real world. It's not enough just to have knowledge in digital space. We need to execute and see examples of this within our physical lives. And that's the standard for us to do church digitally. This is how Jesus handled. Let's look at this. And by the way, there's a full sermon on this. Like y'all pastors, you're better preachers than me. You don't need to hear me preach this. So I'm going to give you a super short version, and I'm going to encourage you, go swing over to thechurch.digital/planting ebook there that's got this in there, blogs that are on this, so much talks about this in greater detail. Ask me questions in YouTube chat. Here's the big picture. John 6. So Jesus has a throng of people following him as we open up into John 6. Why? Because he's been doing signs and wonders. He's been meeting people's physical needs, and that was attractive. People are now clinging to Jesus. He has consumers. They are literally consuming the product. Jesus is literally feeding them. He is feeding thousands as a result, doing signs. And so he's doing these miracles. People are consuming the product. His rank, his number of people who are following, the clinger-ons, yeah, it's at a high level. Now, what's interesting is everybody goes to sleep. Jesus wakes up the next morning and he goes a different path. The disciples go with him, goes a different path. The crowd wakes up and says, hey, I want breakfast. Where's my product that I can consume? And they go looking for Jesus and they find Jesus eventually. And Jesus says to the crowd, hey, I'm not interested in breakfast, but let's talk about some other things. Jesus starts talking crazy, or at least the crowd thinks he's crazy. Jesus is talking more on the spiritual level. He's not giving that easy product. He's having conversations. He's building relationships. He's letting the people better understand who he is. And instead of feeding them breakfast or brunch at this point, he's saying things like, eat my flesh and drink my blood, which the crowd misunderstands, isn't capable of understanding, and quickly gets offended by what Jesus says. Even to the point, if you look at scripture, Jesus says, am I offending you? They're offended by it. The religious hanger-ons started to leave. Jesus engaged in two-way conversation. And through that two-way conversation, some of that consumer, some of that crowd, well, they started to get filtered off. They didn't stick. They didn't make it. And you can even get into John 6:66. I know that's a weird verse. I always feel weird when I say John 6:66. But when you look at that scripture, it literally talks about how the disciples, some of them left. Some of those that Jesus thought were tight walked away. Jesus was never about the reach. He was about the engagement. And the role of the engagement does to filter out the reach. Jesus had a large number of followers. He chased a lot of them away. But what he had after was the core group upon which the church would be built. It was the movement makers that would take us to where we needed to be for tomorrow. Let's go back to the Alan Hirsch. I'd rather have 12 disciples than 1,200 consumers. John 6 is the literal execution of that in Christ's ministry, where he had all sorts of people following and he chased them away because he needed a core group of people that would replicate an idea again and again and again and again. And as we look at this idea of a church in a digital church, well, shoot, I'm going to save that line for you in a little bit. It comes down to this place of we need a church that can replicate itself out. We need to really reimagine what a church needs to look like. You know, if we look into physical church, if we look at the church of today, I would suspect you can say this, and I don't mean any offense by this, please. If you want to send hate mail, it's jeff.reed@stadiachurchplanning.org. It's on the email there. You can, on the screen, you can send it to me. It's fine. But the idea comes down into this. We need an idea that's reproducible. We need a model that's reproducible. And unfortunately, over time, I think the understanding of what a church is, um, well, number one, I'm not sure it's reproducible. Number two, honestly, forgive me, I'm not even sure that a lot of this stuff is biblical. Because at the heart of this, we need to find something that's reproducible. But at the other point, we need to make sure that what we're doing here is actually biblical. And that's the challenge, right? Is we need this idea that can reproduce, but we want to hold it to the standards that the Bible calls us to. And really, as we start to examine what's happening in our physical buildings, honestly, it just gives an opportunity for me to pause and look at this and say, is what we're doing in the physical church realm biblical? Or are there parts of this that need to get reimagined? Are there parts of this that need to be regrounded in a biblical foundation? And that's really the approach that we're taking with our digital church planters. You see, the idea is not just to reproduce what's happening in a physical building, but instead, digitally, but instead, look at what the scripture is calling us to do and do that digitally. What happens in a physical building may not always work in a digital space, but that's not because of the building or that's not because of the digital. It's just because digital and physical are two different things. Just like you can connect with community before you connect with Christ in digital space, but that's not necessarily the way that it works physical. That's a great example. You're going to get more people loyal to listening to a long message in physical space than you will in a digital, because they don't have that social pressure in the digital space to listen to that long sermon. And so it comes this with this idea of reimagining while looking at scripture. And I love this. Sometimes I talk about things and it's like, man, this is really crazy. And then I meet somebody else that's on the same path with me, that's asking the same questions. And I'm like, this is beautiful. And so the Wesleyan church actually was wrestling with a lot of these same issues, where they were trying to figure out how to get their physical church to multiply. They wanted to go into micro. They wanted to go into digital. They wanted to reimagine what this idea of church is, not taking it away from the biblical foundation, but instead trying to figure out what the essential ecclesiology for that organization is, what that reproducible model is, what the core functions of it is, that we need to make sure that this sticks. And so 2017, years before COVID, Ed Love, director of multiplication for the Wesleyan Church, went on a journey, started bringing in other people to have conversations to discover what this idea of ecclesiology would be, what this essential core is. Because when he looked at the Wesleyan Church, no offense, don't send hate mail. When he looked at the Wesleyan Church, he saw, man, there's a lot of stuff here that isn't reproducible. And I'm not even sure what's here is biblical. So let's figure out what we need to do so we can multiply our denomination, our churches through that. By the way, phenomenal conversation with Ed Love. Go to that, thechurch.digital/planting, and you can listen to the interview in there. I just rolled it out maybe a month ago. Phenomenal conversation there. DJ Soto, so many podcasts with him on the same page, where he said basically the same time, it's time to stop recreating physical church digitally. And instead, it's time to start reimagining what a digital church is. And that's really the heart of what we need to do, is not copy physical church digital. It's a whole new process. As we're assessing planters within Stadia, we are constantly wrestling with, what does a planter need to be? What are the skill sets? What are the attributes? What are the strengths? How are they scoring on this assessment? It's not a carbon copy. I mean, I can give you details on this, but essentially, I think you need to be a much stronger catalytic leader in order to do things at a physical church, to plant a physical church. But I think your heart for disciple making, your heart for networking, needs to be much higher if you're going to be a digital church planner than a physical. And that's just maybe one of maybe a dozen different attributes that we're like, maybe would score this one higher than this. And it's funny, like we'll have people that go through that assessment process in the we had one just recently, a physical church planner who went through the physical process, and then like literally right before the cohort started, he's like, you know what, I changed my mind. I want to go digital. And we almost had to reassess the guy, take him through the process to make sure that everything was going to line up, because it's not an apples to apples comparison. All right. I'll be honest, probably one of the biggest challenges that the church is facing here, or at least the digital church, is coming in form of Acts 8. Now, Acts 8, this is where Stephen is martyred. The church is persecuted. We see the dispersion of the church out. Acts 8:4, I think it literally says, those who have been scattered preach the word wherever they went. You know, for me, I paraphrase a little bit in here. Those who have been scattered or met online preach the word wherever they went, digitally or physically. Because for me, whether it's persecution or just lack of location, I see that dispersion happening within the digital church. Jim Tomberlin's probably one of the founding fathers, founding people that were really started doing the multi-site movement. Some of you may know him from Multi-Site Solutions, Multi-Site Guys, his social media moniker. I think he's with Unstuck Group at this time, at this point. But Jim said recently on a podcast that I did with him, the goal of the church is not to grow as big as possible. The goal of the church is to grow and then multiply, go out, grow again, and then multiply and go out. And this is where I think that we've really lost this. But this is where I think, just because of the scalability of digital churches have such a better opportunity to scale. Because for us, for a digital church, and I truly do believe this, it's not a digital building where people gather. The point of a digital church is not to amass a large number of people, like Christ had a large number of people following him because of his signs and wonders and miracles. That's not the point. It's not a virtual building. Instead, it's a virtual distribution network where we are sending people out, just like Paul used the Roman roads with by messenger, sending letter to connect with churches around, to provide encouragement, to provide training, to strengthen, to resource. I see a model of that existing, utilizing the interwebs like Paul used the Roman road, where it's far more about a distribution network for the gospel and where that lands in place. And so, church, we've got a phenomenal opportunity to connect with, to engage with, to build relationships with, to make disciples of people that our physical buildings never would have touched because of location, because of culture. We've got an opportunity to disciple, to shape, to redefine what the church is, and to reach people in digital communities that never would have been touched by the gospel had we not gone in. And so for us, Stadia, we are looking for opportunities to do this. Hey, let me give you one caution before we close here. Remember here, healthy church is not about technology. It's about the relationships. It's not about gathering. It is definitely about equipping. It's not about just reach. You need the reach. I don't come across too hard. It's not about the reach, but it's also about the engagement. It's not about content. It's not about your sermons. It's definitely about disciple making. It's not about being on brand. I would say it's definitely about getting people multiplied and getting them on mission. And I'll say this, it's not about the institution. It's very much about the individuals that make up that institution and how those individuals are paired, are equipped, are engaged, are made disciples, and are capable of making other disciples. Technology is cold, it's distant. And so it's very easy to fall back into this automation of disciple making, fall back into this content, fall back into this, let me just play this video and you guys watch. I've been talking for roughly 40 minutes here. And I'll be honest, like, it's a struggle for me. I have no idea if this content is landing with you, if you think this is a great idea, if you think this is a horrible idea. I'm recording this on a Sunday afternoon. You'll finally watch it in 2 weeks. And so without me having some sort of engagement, without me working hard to overcome the coldness of this, like me being in the chat room right now, yeah, I said hi. Without that interaction, I don't know if this is working. And so it's very easy for us to press play on the virtual VCR, to watch all these views show up on our Facebook Live, to watch all these red numbers show up for who's coming, or I guess green numbers because they're green. They're watching. It's very easy for us to celebrate that, but that's not the win. And the struggle for us as a church is to realize that Jesus didn't stop with the reach; he engaged, and that's where he made it into disciples. And that's where a digital church has so much more opportunity to get that reach, to get that engagement, and to multiply them out. and to send them out to recreate a smaller, scalable model to do that. And so if you're interested in virtual reality church, if you're interested in video game church, social media church, if you want to utilize digital tools to hyper focus on specific neighborhoods within a town and disciple them in digital space, whatever the application is, there's probably applications I've not even thought of at this point. We're literally talking, I hadn't even thought of Final Fantasy 14 until about a month ago. And I had a conversation with a planner who's like, yeah, I'm interested in going into Final Fantasy 14. And so I'm scrambling trying to learn what she's doing and how I can help her. Or the guy that used to be with a Christian band, a praise and worship band, who's like, I've got all these contacts and they're not attending church anymore. I want to create a digital church just based off my network of fans who used to be with this Christian praise and worship band. And maybe there's an opportunity for me to disciple them, to re-engage them, and to get them to create something new where they are. See, that's a beautiful thing about digital. There's so much potential to do things different than you can in the physical building. That should be celebrated, that should be honored, and that should be tried. That should be experimented with, and that should be iterated with. Let's modify it, let's adjust it, and let's keep finding the better idea out there for the kingdom, right? So if you are interested in doing this, reach out to me. Once again, my email address is jeff.reed@stadiachurchplanting.org. Once again, you'll find a ton of resources over at thechurch.digital/planting. And let me say this, just even to wrap up here. Take a moment here, churches. We are looking to partner with churches to plant digital churches or help finding digital only church planters. If you know someone who's interested in this, if you have someone on your staff, or if you're interested in connecting up, Jeff with Stadia Church Planting, would love to have that conversation. Once again, thank you for the invite. Very much appreciate it. Y'all have a good day.